አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን አምቢኝ ብለው የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና ዕውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎ ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን አደባባይ infomedia@gmail.com፣ በዌብሳይታችን www.adebabai.com። ያግኙን፣ ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ።
እንኳን ከዘመነ ዮሐንስ ወደ ዘመነ ማቴዎስ በሰላም በጤና አሸጋገረን። አዲሱ ዓመት የሰላም፣ የፍቅር፣ የጤና፣ የአብሮነትና የስኬት ዓመት እንዲሆን አደባባይ ሚዲያ መልካም ምኞቱን ይገልጻል።
በአዲስ ዓመት ኢትዮጵያውያን በተስፋ ስሜት ይለመልማሉ። ታዳጊዎች በባህል ልብስ አሸብርቀው በደስታ ይፈነድቃሉ። ችቦም አቀጣጥለው እዮህ አበባዬ መስከረም ጠባዬ በማለት አዲሱን ዓመት በደስታ ይቀበሉታል።
አደባባይ ሚዲያ በአዲስ ዓመት በተሟላ ዝግጅት በእውነት ላይ ተመስርቶ መረጃዎችን ለእናንተ ለውድ ተመልካቾቻችን ለማድረስ እንደ ወትሮ ሁሉ ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች፣ ቃለ መጠይቆች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች በነጠረ እውነትና በላቀ ዕውቀት ላይ በመመስረት በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይስተናገዳሉ። የሁላችንም ስለሆነችው ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። መልካም አዲስ ዓመት። አደባባይ ሚዲያ።
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us from around the world for yet another Viewers Digest here in Adebabai Media. Today, I am again with my co-host Theo Tadessa here with you. We have a very special program for you today. Please stay tuned.
Welcome back, everyone, and I would like to welcome our guest for today, Dr. Yirga Woldeyes. Dr. Yirga was born and raised in the holy town of Lalibela. He is a writer, published poet, a senior lecturer, and a researcher. He is currently doing his work at the Center for Human Rights and Education in Curtin University, Australia. In Ethiopia, he has been a shepherd, a preacher, helped deliver babies as a health assistant, professor of law, and worked with grassroots organizations such as AfroFlag before completing his doctorate in Australia. Dr. Yirga's research focuses on critical study of development, education, and law, and the importance of lived experience and diversity for decolonial and sustainable futures. He has written a book along this topic called Native Colonialism. He also has an organization called ትምህርትና ዕውቀቶች ማዕከል, or Society for Indigenous Education, in short, HABEMA. We have borrowed our discussion topic today from his recent publication, Colonial Rewriting of African History, Misinterpretation and Distortion of Bleicher and Kleiner's Life and Struggle of Wolaita Petros, published in the Journal of Afro-Asiatic Languages, History and Culture, which is a critic of the book, The Life and Struggle of Our Mother, Wolaita Petros, a 17th century African biography of an Ethiopian woman by Gelaw Woldeyes, edited and translated by Wendy Bleicher and Michael Clyde. Thank you, Dr. Yirga, for being here with us, and Happy New Year.
Thank you so much for having me, and Happy New Year.
Yeah, if we could just start our conversation for today, if you could start by telling us what colonial scholarship is and how that operates.
Thank you. I think that's a very important question when we think about knowledge in Africa, because almost all over the world, people have a particular view of Africa. Africa is a very large continent with so many countries, diverse traditions and cultures. But the name, the word Africa, represents a particular type of image in the minds of people. And the question of colonial scholarship is to ask, what type of image do we have about Africa, and who constructed that image? Because, you know, people can easily talk about slavery, how slavery impoverished Africans, how colonialism impoverished Africans. But there is a third and particularly important factor that contributed to Africa's current crisis, current situations, and that is the epistemic empire, or the empire of knowledge that really disempowers and affects Africa significantly. So whenever I want to explain what colonial scholarship means today, I try to kind of tell people or my students in class about the two Africas that exist today. There's not just one Africa, there are two Africas. The first Africa is what I call the real Africa, where real people live in Africa, living their daily life. Real life is dynamic, is changing, it cannot be represented by words. So we cannot really talk about real life using few, words like Africa, culture, and so on. But there is what is called the imagined Africa. How Africa is represented in writing, in films, in popular discourse, in politics. And this imagined Africa is the Africa that dominates our mind. It is a construction of language, of knowledge. So my interest in colonial scholarship is to really think about this imagined Africa, because whenever we talk about Africa, we're not really talking about real people's experiences, what people are doing in the villages, in the churches. We instead engaging with an Africa, an image that is constructed by writers, especially Western writers. So my interest in colonial scholarship is to really know and remember that whenever we talk about Africa, oftentimes we are engaging with this imagined Africa, the image of Africa that is constructed through languages and knowledge. And so when we come to really thinking about education, about representation, we read about Africa from writers that have the power to represent people in their own culture, which is in the West and represented in Western culture. So colonial scholarship is this legacy that has been there starting from the period where Europeans went to Africa, started to write about Africa based on their own assumptions, based on their own needs, and based on the demands that existed within their own culture. Something sensational, primitive, important was regarded as, valuable in terms of constructing the West as a culture of civilization, of higher standard, and so on. So colonial scholarship is a very wide concept. It encompasses the whole literature and the whole construction of images, feelings, and ideas about Africa. And what we read through this literature, through this particular book or particular reading that I wrote, is how this construction was made and is being perpetuated today.
Mm-hmm. So in that case, then, how has the West been writing about Africa? If you could give us some examples about that.
Yeah, the writing of the West about other places, not just Africa, but the non-Western world in general, has been criticized by so many writers. As you know, one of the most prominent one is the writings of Edward Said, Orientalism.
Yeah.
What Orientalism taught us is actually what Westerners were writing about Africa. The literature they had about Africa was based on their own feelings and understandings of the other. Because within the Western tradition, within Western Enlightenment or Western thought, there was this notion of looking at reality, looking at places by dividing them as self and other, or we and the other. The other represents a very backward, primitive image, which makes the self, the we, more important than the other. So based on this method, based on this kind of formula or methodology, almost every writing that was regarded as important in the West about other cultures presented characteristics that are considered to be primitive in the West. So Edward Said's writing basically tells us that how the other was constructed using the knowledge and power of the West. If you really consider Africa in particular, even it goes beyond the construction of the Orient in Said's sense, because the African other was actually constructed as a very negative, the worst form of humanity, in terms of it being savage, in terms of it being having no value for humanity. Take the example of Hegel. In Hegel's construction of universal history, where history is taught as something that emerges from the East and grows and eventually reaches into maturity in Europe. And then that makes Europe the end of history. In this formulation of history, Hegel's understanding or Hegel's assertion was that Africa is not even part of world history. It is enveloped in the dark mantle of night. People do not have the consciousness, the capacity to write, to progress, to develop history. So we can simply disregard Africa as having no value for world history, no contribution for knowledge. So that is an example which is still used by so many writers whenever they engage with African texts. They don't really consider them to be genuinely African. That includes Ethiopian writings, for example. If you look at the Oriental construction of Ethiopia and the interpretation of Ethiopian manuscripts by so many writers in the past, they don't really consider Ethiopian writings as genuinely African writing. They instead wanted to look at it as a writing that came from the East, from a light-skinned Semitic, which came from Arabia, for example, in the Ethiopian sense. The West has been writing about Africa by giving Africa primitive characteristics, primitive images, making Africa as having no literature, no history, no culture that is important for learning. So the interest of writing about Africa comes from a curiosity to understand the primitive aspect of life, how people struggle with their visceral, emotional state of existence, with their animality. From that, then to draw and say that we actually have the burden, the responsibility to civilize them, to give them education. And they don't even have to learn their own culture, their own history, because it is useless. We have to export our culture, our religion, our aid, in order to civilize them. So that is a colonial thesis and the colonial scholarship, which views Africa simply as a source of raw materials, not just for the industries, but also for the production of knowledge, for writing.
It always fascinates me how, when we talk about Ethiopian civilization, how some writers try to take that outside of Africa and try to, in a sense, take away the knowledge and understanding of what Africa is and trying to move that into the Middle Eastern knowledge so that we stay in the quote unquote, the Africa that they understand, like you were saying, that the Africa that's imagined, right? The Africa that we don't live day to day. So that's always fascinating to me. So in that sense, then, what is colonial rewriting of African history, and why does it continue to happen even now, knowing that we have so many researchers that show otherwise?
I think that's a very good question. You know, it's very fascinating because after Edward Said 30 years ago, he wrote that book, and it really transformed the thinking of so many writers in all over the world. But you still find this Orientalist literature, Orientalist approach entrenched in so many places. Partly it is because there is the appetite for it. People are fascinated to know strange things happening in Africa. There's even an example once, someone, who was regarded as a discoverer or writer in Africa, in Central Africa, was going, he wanted to find out how people commit cannibalism in Africa. He wanted to show to his audience, a scene, a live scene, by painting how people, eat other people. He couldn't find the people doing that. He ended up forcing certain groups of people, buying a girl in Central Africa and inducing them to commit that atrocious act. You can see that, you know, the desire to know something leads people to invent what they want to see. And another important point also is knowledge is not produced because it exists. There has to be power behind it. You know, there are three important factors for the production of any idea or knowledge, or for it to become practical. First, you know, you have ideas about Ethiopia, for example. The Semitic thesis that you mentioned, how people were writing about Ethiopian literature being an import from Saudi Arabia. There are other literatures that counteract this thesis. Ethiopians were writing that their literature and ideas are originally African. There are scientific studies that disprove the Semitic import and show that the Afro-Asiatic languages that gave rise to the language of the Semitic, the Cushitic, and other languages is indigenous to Ethiopia or to Africa. And it actually, the civilization and language actually went out of Ethiopia into the Arabian Peninsula, not the other way around. We have that type of writings that counteract this colonial rewriting. But the problem is the question of power. Who has money? Who has institutions to publish, to teach, to tell to the world? So, Western knowledge is not simply knowledge, it also is institutions. It also is, there's also funding. For example, in Ethiopia, the education system does not incorporate our own history. We are studying and learning in the language of Europeans, although more than 90% of our people do not speak the language. We are learning and studying in English. That means our knowledge is not meant to serve our own people. It is meant to serve people who can read English. That means the entire education system is actually created for the service of people other than Ethiopians. Now, all of this happened and continues to happen because there are institutions which support this. Education in Africa, for example, is supported by financial institutions that promote education to be market-driven, and local languages, local people, poor people are not regarded as useful for the markets. That means people are made to study for those who can pay, for those who can read their theses and texts. And colonial scholarship continues to flourish and is still active because there are institutions, there is many people who are writing critically about the West, especially in Ethiopia, do not really have anywhere to go and publish their writings, because the people who require you literature, references, reviewers, a lot of people are part of that structure, and they often filter out critical and alternative voices. So that is why, because of this institutional colonization, because of the colonization of knowledge, which selects which type of knowledge should go to the literature, should go to the media, and which interprets those ideas into practice, into policy. Because of this, the colonial literature still continues, although or despite the fact that there are alternative criticisms and ideas that are not institutionalized, that are not really meant to be applied in practice, and so on.
Yeah, when you talk about that, what I remember is I remember reading Heart of Darkness when I was in school, and that was taught to us as part of this modern classical, books. And I also remember reading, Edward Said's criticism of it and Chinua Achebe's criticism of it, and why we should not continue to read this book, especially considering it as classical when it depicts Africans, right, in a very demeaning manner, like comparing them to animals and giving them features that we don't like, that doesn't really qualify as human, but that still continues to be perpetrated. And like my niece is in high school and she's about to read that book as well, and I'm just like really fascinated that we continue to read these books, even though, like you said, there are so many papers and research is being done, and so many people fighting against these ideas, because we do like that idea of otherness, and we do like that idea of wanting to know who Africans are, this mystery of like the exotic, and also at the same time like the lesser human beings. But to continue that, I guess, to borrow your word as well, why is the interpretation of text, when we're talking about how we interpret text and how we use African or any other literature, really, when we write about it in a way that harms the history and culture and the identity of the people from whom they are taken, continues to be unchallenged?
Yeah, I think this interpretation of texts continue to be unchallenged, mainly for the reasons that I mentioned, because ideologically, in terms of idea, in terms of providing alternatives, they are challenged all the time. But they continue to be perpetuated because as I said, these institutions want to maintain their power and control over a large number of people like our own. So you see, every knowledge does not simply emerge from a free-thinking mind. There's no as such an idea that flows from a person who has never been tainted by any kind of prejudice or any kind of prior conceptions of the world. Every knowledge emerges from a context. A knowledge itself becomes a context for another knowledge. So Western knowledge has been a context for the production of other Western knowledges. It reproduces itself using others' experiences as raw material, incorporating them into its own logic. In this process of incorporation and recreating and rewriting the history of other people, there are at least three fundamental things that places like Ethiopia or Africa lose. The first thing is, it's also reflected in this book and probably in a much deeper level by others, is how Africans or Ethiopians lose the sense of time, the sense of history that they have. This is important because when writers coming from the West wrote about Africa, tell to Africa, or even teach today our students who are going to universities and colleges, what they simply and really show is that the past of Africans, the past of Ethiopians, is the past of the Europeans. We are currently living the past of Europe in this formulation, because the past of Europe is imagined as a primitive stage of medieval fighting, of ethnicism, of tribalism, of violence. So the past, and not just the past, the present of places like Africa and Ethiopia is constructed as the past of Europeans. That means in their formulation, we're made to live in the past of Europe. That means we lose our history and the past. And what is also presented as a production, a new knowledge, is the future. If we follow what they tell us, we read their texts, we follow their development and other approaches, benchmarks, implement and follow everything that they do. If we do what they do, our future will become their present. That means in the future, our aim, our destiny is nothing but to become like the West. In this formulation, we don't have the past. We don't have also the future. Our past and the present is simply the past of the Europeans. We are made to imagine our present in the past of Europe, which means a past of Europe which was really full of medieval fighting, of tribalism. If you know the history of Europe, there was a lot of violence in the past on the basis of religion, on the basis of all kinds of things that marked really the past of Europe. So because of that, the frameworks, the thinking that's presented, the writers which really emphasize writing about Africa is not how we live together. It's not how beautiful our culture is. It's not how wonderful and important our indigenous understandings and languages are, and how we can really develop starting from this organic existence, organic life that we have, and become or transformed to become better. Instead, it emphasizes and focuses on division, focuses on every instance of history that shows some kind of violence, So history itself becomes violent to us because history, if you think about it, you cannot write everything about the past, because if we write everything about the past, our present will be simply reinterpreting and writing everything. That's impossible. When history is written, someone has to make a selection. You select events, you connect them together and create a narrative to present to the people that your past looks like this, and on the basis of this, you have to construct the future, your future in this way. So that is the work of history. So what is being done is actually to select war, conflict, difference in the past, put them together as an entire existence of our past, so that our future will be nothing different from addressing the past. So this is another way of not just colonizing the past, but colonizing the future, because history is written for the sake of the future, not for the past. Now, this whole interpretation and really critical thinking is then important, because even when we read history, by talking about war, by talking about violence and conflict, history becomes a war against the present. It becomes a war against our own mind, our own imagination, our own Ethiopian identity. What this type of knowledge creates is not just history, but also identity. When we ask ourselves, who am I as an Ethiopian? Who am I an African? I don't have any other reference. I don't have any other idea to learn about Africa. Go to many museums in the West today. If you see African sections, you find these primitive representations of Africa, as if Africa has nothing other than primitivism and so on. So these constructions of identity are politics of the future. They don't know politics of the past. They don't really talk bad things about our history. They actually construct our future, in what type of path, in what type of society we are going to live. So that is why I am really interested in engaging texts like this as Africans, as Ethiopians, because we have alternative narratives. Now, you mentioned Edward Said, you mentioned Achebe. There are so many people who critically wrote about the West. But there is also one important thing that is missing from their entire writing, in my own sense, I think, in the way I feel it. And that is, how about Africans? How about the Orient? Edward Said didn't write what the Orients, what the Easterners were thinking about themselves or about the West. He wrote how the West represented the Orient. You know, a lot of Africans, a lot of critical scholars, when they really challenge the West, they successfully challenge and show it is imperialistic construction, but they don't really engage with Africa's actual texts, partly because they don't have access to it. Take, for example, the Ethiopian literature, Ethiopian Giz sources. You can take the writing of Mudimbe, The Invention of Africa. He successfully critically looks how Africa has been invented through Western ideas of representation, alterity, and so on. But as the last part of his book, he says something about Ethiopian sources of knowledge. Something which is written by Professor Claude Sumner, which was my own professor in Addis Ababa University as well. That shows you that, you know, Africans, although they try to engage with Ethiopian texts, they don't have access to it. It's written in Giz. And it's only the Westerners who present themselves as Giz experts. They are the ones who say, we know Giz, we can translate it, we can write it. They're the ones who have the institutions, the funding to write about Africa. When they do that, they break the connection between Ethiopian history and African history, so that Africans do not have access to these indigenous materials. After successfully defending themselves against the imperialist construction of the West, they also need indigenous materials to talk about their history. Rastafarianism, Ethiopianism were movements to tap into these indigenous knowledges. But unfortunately, because Ethiopians could not write about themselves, because the Ethiopian education system is colonized, as my book Native Colonialism shows. We cannot produce and connect with the diaspora, with Ethiopians who live in foreign countries, to really understand the original material that they have in their own country about themselves. So all of these things really go together in critically thinking about knowledge and why it is important to value our indigenous ideas.
Yeah, you said something really powerful, and I wonder if you could expand on it a little bit. You mentioned that Europeans, when they're, when they're going to school and when they're learning about their ideas, right? They continue to learn those ideas, and they continue to build on those ideas as time passes. And we kind of don't have that access if we're speaking specifically about Ethiopia, where right now we're learning about Western ideas, and we completely has disregarded our traditional schooling. And in that sense, as you mentioned, that this idea of being in war with the past is really evidence of like our current situation and what we're living right now. So how is that we did this to ourselves, right? It's not like someone went ahead and colonized us and enforced this on ourselves. And I think you mentioned this, you talk a lot about this in your book, Native Colonialism. So how does that process really work? If you could just expand on that a little bit for us.
You mean my work on Native Colonialism?
Yeah, and how the disconnects between this modern schooling that we chose to go through and the traditional schooling, which has, indigenous knowledges of Ethiopia that we could build on top of, which we're not really right now.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, because when I started to do my PhD, the question that I was asking myself was, because I came from a law background. I was a lawyer in Ethiopia. I grew up in Lalibela, went to the Abinat Timurt a little bit, and did Sanat Timurt Beit, spiritual education in the church with monks and the great scholars at Lalibela. And when I went to schools, the entire school system tells you about poverty as a concept, not based on what we experience in our own life, but based on books that are written by other people without considering our experiences. So there is this disconnection between the ideas and the real world those ideas were meant to represent. Our life, the experience of our scholars, the farmers, our everything that we have, the real life that we have, is not part of the text we're learning and studying. So I went to law school. In law school, Ethiopians are not. The Ethiopians are, when you graduate and go to practice law, you practice in the local language. You practice in Amharic or in whatever language you have within Ethiopia. And our lecturers and instructors are Ethiopians. Law is legislated in Ethiopian languages, but we're made to study in English. And we are made to study in a language we wouldn't used to practice. And then after that, when I came to Australia and I started to really critically think about all of these things, I said, look, the hope that everyone talks about Africa, the hope that we have is education. Yeah, everyone says, if you build more schools, if you expand education, your problems will be taken care of. But if you think about it, we have more educated people today than before. We have more schools than before. We have expanded and invested significantly. Not enough, of course, we need more education, but we did that. But our problems have become more intractable, more entrenched, and difficult to solve. Why do we have more problems with more education? Why is education not solving the problems it was meant to solve? But one of the reality is that actually what we call education is not education about our life. It's not about our existence or making life better. Education was about Western education. What they call the right to education is the right to Western education, not the right to Ethiopian education. It's actually an education to study interpreting your own society, your experience using the languages and concepts of the West. So all of this really become, for me, so important to critically question what education itself is. People, when they write and research about education, they focus on, making the schools better, building more schools, but they really don't think what goes into the minds of the students, what type of texts they should read, what type of curriculum we should create based on their lived experiences and so on. So education become part of this then global colonial system that continues to perpetuate the inferior position of Africans as imitators, some people say, oh, if we step out of that and try to create our own education, we'll be left out and we'll be outside of the world and so on. But that is a fear that is constructed without any substance. Because if you want to really improve your life, you have to start from life itself, not from the life of other people. So coming to your idea, and why I'm also interested in the criticism of the article that I wrote on colonial rewriting of African history, is very much related to this. As soon as this text was translated by Western writers, although Ethiopians are translating it within Ethiopia in Amharic, and people are talking about it, as soon as it is translated by incorporating ideas that are sensational and fascinating in the Western culture, in the Western society, it just becomes popular all of a sudden. All of a sudden, Petros, for example, become so important in the world that everyone wants to read, and it went immediately global. So, it's very much connected to this epistemic empire. We live in an empire of knowledge. We're swimming in it. I'm part of that, although I'm critical of it. I'm critical of it doesn't mean that I have the real African experiences and sources that should go into the minds of the people. What I try to do is to show this imperial construction of knowledge, the violence of knowledge, so that people who have ideas in Ethiopia, in Africa, could have the opportunity to teach us, including myself, about life within their own world. When I write this criticism, what I did is, of course, I challenge this colonial construction, but at the same time, I open the space, this academic space, for people who are living in Ethiopia, these scholars who study the texts in their original languages, scholars which are ignored by these interpreters, calling them they are biased. We don't want to include their ideas. I open that space because their space has been taken over. They were disregarded. They're considered as irrelevant in the interpretation of their own life, their own material. So what we do as Ethiopians, as scholars, is not to go out and teach and preach our own people, but instead to open the space for them so that they can teach their children and pass on their tradition. They can teach us so that their ideas become part of our scholarship, and we bring those ideas into the world. So that basically is what I try to do through this writing.
Yeah, thank you. That's really powerful. We are having a conversation about colonial rewriting of African history. I'd like to remind our users to please like our show, subscribe if you haven't, and share with your friends and family as well. And we'll be right back after a short break.
እንኳን ከዘመነ ዮሐንስ ወደ ዘመነ ማቴዎስ በሰላም በጤና አሸጋገረን። አዲሱ ዓመት የሰላም፣ የፍቅር፣ የጤና፣ የአብሮነትና የስኬት ዓመት እንዲሆን አደባባይ ሚዲያ መልካም ምኞቱን ይገልጻል።
በአዲስ ዓመት ኢትዮጵያውያን በተስፋ ስሜት ይለመልማሉ። ታዳጊዎች በባህል ልብስ አሸብርቀው በደስታ ይፈነድቃሉ። ችቦም አቀጣጥለው እዮሃ አበባዬ መስከረም ጠባዬ በማለት አዲሱን ዓመት በደስታ ይቀበሉታል።
አደባባይ ሚዲያ በአዲስ ዓመት በተሟላ ዝግጅት በእውነት ላይ ተመስርቶ መረጃዎችን ለእናንተ ለውድ ተመልካቾቻችን ለማድረስ እንደ ወትሮ ሁሉ ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች፣ ቃለ መጠይቆች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች በነጠረ እውነትና በላቀ እውቀት ላይ በመመስረት በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይስተናገዳሉ። የሁላችንም ስለሆነችው ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። መልካም አዲስ ዓመት። አደባባይ ሚዲያ
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for staying with us all this time. We've been having a great conversation with Dr. Yirga. Dr. Yirga, it's a pleasure to be with you today. Adababa Media, please don't forget to share and like our conversation so others could also indulge in this conversation and join us in this beautiful conversation. Dr. Yirga, again, it's a really honor to be with you, and I have just been reading your book, just starting yesterday. Honestly, I'm a student and I haven't been able to finish the book, but I'm halfway through it, and it's beautifully written, and it took me back to some of my experiences, or reminiscing back to some of the monasteries that you mentioned. For example, Woldeyes is a place that I was fortunate to visit twice. And also Waleta Petros, I had known some background about her, even though I haven't been able to visit her monastery. Let's dive into your this book that you have written, why you have written it, and if you could tell us a little bit about Waleta Petros as well. Who is Waleta Petros, and why the book was written in the beginning?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you. This is I came to be interested in this topic when I did my sabbatical research in last year. I traveled to Rema and other areas in Lake Tana monasteries as I used to. I, for example, when I was quite young, when I was a teenager, I left Lalibela and went to Daga Stefanos to become a monk when I was quite young. Stayed in the monastery for a short time. I didn't manage to really become a monk. It was very hard for me to continue, and upon the advice of elders there, I returned back and continued my education. So those experiences give me a particular insight into the life that takes place in that space, in that important and sacred place. And also when I did my research, I traveled to see, because my research focuses on knowledge grabbing and epistemic violence. We often talk about African land grabbing, but there is also another grabbing, which is the land grab of African knowledges, or the taking of African resources and storing them in Western archives. Although preserving them is good, but these materials are not accessible to Abinat students or indigenous Ethiopian students. And I wanted to see the impact of this collection of materials by Western collectors, not just Western actually, but also within Ethiopia itself. There are institutions that gather these materials, and they don't make them available to Abinat or indigenous students. They make them available to Western researchers or researchers who are interested to do their writing in English. So I was looking at how this kind of apartheid of knowledge is being perpetuated in Ethiopia, and so the two parts of my research, one is knowledge grabbing, as the one I mentioned now, but the second part is epistemic violence. I call epistemic violence, it's a violence based on knowledge. How some knowledges can become violent to the people who use them because of their power position, and in trying to understand that, I wanted to see how not just our manuscripts are taken, but also how they are interpreted in a way that dehumanizes our identity, that takes away what we want to tell to the world. So this becomes one of the examples of the books that I become interested to explore, to show how misrepresentations of Ethiopian and African identities. This is not, as you can see, the book itself, the big book translated by the two scholars, is presented as an African history. So it represents the whole of Africa. So how African identity is constructed based on these materials, or how indigenous sources are used to not amplify their own existence and experience, but instead attack them, using their own material. And that really is a kind of scholarship that's been taking place in the West for a long time. So that is a background that I become interested in. And speaking of Wolatta Petros, then Wolatta Petros lived in a time of Ethiopian history that was really critically important. Actually, when I was at Rema, one monk which I met around Bahar Dar, we're having a conversation about the time that we live in, and he said, my son, we live in a time of Wolatta Petros. This is a time when Ethiopians are collaborating with foreigners in attacking our own culture, in attacking our own identity, and so on. So Wolatta Petros lived in a time when Ethiopians, including the king himself, were collaborating with the Roman emperor, the Roman Catholicism, and submitting to the Roman Church by converting the government into Catholicism. So it was a period of Susnios. And Susnios, as we know, came at a time that was really critically important in Ethiopian history, where he introduced Catholicism, was very violent to Ethiopians who resisted that conversion. This is a significant deal because Ethiopia's existence on the base of Kibra Negest is on the belief that the Ethiopian empire or the Ethiopian king is greater than the Romans. The Kibra Negest compares Rome, the Judea, and Ethiopia, and says because the Ark of the Covenant is within Ethiopia, because Ethiopia is a resting place of the covenant or God, in their belief, they have this belief that they are better and more important than the Romans. On top of that, of course, the doctrinal and writings and all of that they have within their own country about Orthodox Tewahedo Church is profoundly important, well developed in the literature of the people. So he was going against that. And Wolatta Petros, when she was born, her mother was Christos Ivaya, her father Bahar Seged. She grew up studying about Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo beliefs. And when she grew up, because she was born to a family that was within the royal family system, and she was born at a place called an area called Dawaro and Fatiga. It might be like in the southern area of Ethiopia today. So she was born and raised in that area, and she was married to a high official of the king, Susnios, and his name was Lisana Christos. And she started to live a married life with this man, but she was unhappy. She was unhappy because she was strongly convicted and committed to her faith, and her faith gave her the narratives, understanding of the world in terms of valuing what is important for Ethiopia and herself in opposition to the others. And when her husband tried to suppress Orthodox Tewahedo believers, or those people who are resisting Catholicism, she left her house and went to a monastery to become a nun. When her husband returned, heard that she left the house, then he decided to take an army and started to burn villages of the place where she was in or she was hiding. Then at that time, she decided to go back in order to save the villagers. After she returned with her husband, another event occurred. The Ethiopian Tewahedo patriarch was murdered by the order of the king, and the person who slaughtered this patriarch gave the clothes of the patriarch to her husband, and her husband brought the clothes to the house as a trophy.
Is this the archbishop that came from Coptic, right? When you say patriarch of Ethiopia?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Because we were under the, okay.
But we have to understand that relationship is there's also important distinction between Coptic and Ethiopian Tawahedo. Although that symbolic representation of a patriarch exists, in terms of what we do in the Ethiopian church is indigenous. Now, I think probably we'll come back to this later, but one remark I want to make, or footnote I want to make, is that when we talk about Christianity in Ethiopia, a lot of people confuse it with Western Christianity. And that is where the problem is, especially to get along with African brothers or other non-Western places that are oppressed by Christianity, Western Christianity, as an ideology of colonialism. Now, Ethiopian indigenous Christianity is much older than Western colonial type of Christianity, a Christianity that gave permission to the colonial conquest of, starting from Latin America or to all over the world. So this indigenous Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which includes the importance of the Ark of the Covenant, the Tabot, the importance of place, the importance of all the calendar, the time, the traditional beliefs that we have, all of these things was important for Wolete Petros. It was important to maintain this. So when she realized that he did this crime, she despised him. She started to live a life of like a hermit. She avoided contacting him, talking to him, eating food, and so on. And he decided to leave her. And then she left his place, went to her relatives, and then finally she ended up going to a monastery, to Zage. On her way to that monastery, she met with a priest. A priest came to her and told her, it is not good for you to go alone. We have to remember she's coming from dignitaries who are hated by the ordinary people because of their conversion. It could be dangerous for her. And spiritually, it's always good to be with spiritual friends than to go alone. So he found another sister for her called Hita Christos. And according to the text, it says it was God's will for her and Hita Christos to come along and go together to this spiritual journey. So Wolete Petros went to monastery with Hita Christos and with other nuns, and she started the life of service, as you might have noticed when you went to Woldeyes. One of the great things, and of course when I was in Daga Stephanos too, one of the hard things for me to endure was the long hours of fasting and the very hard work that you have to do when you're living in a monastery. So she was doing that with passion. And she was serving, and then she became a nun. And she went out and started to tell the people that they should not convert to Catholicism. She started to teach the priests and to tell the priests that they should not call the name of the king during their Qadasi, the mass. As you know, in Ethiopian Orthodox mass, the priestess used to call the name of the king and pray for him, or for a queen, or pray for her. But she asked them not to do that because he doesn't deserve it. He has converted into a foreign faith. Now the king heard this and he was so angry, and he required her to attend the court. And she didn't back down. She wanted to continue that journey. He gave a strong warning not to preach against him anymore, and left her for the first time. After that, there's a long, there are many things that happen in between, but I'm just jumping from one to another. That she ended up going to Woldeyes, and that is a turning point of her life. When she went to Woldeyes, she started again a service. She was serving another nun there. And then she started this life of Filsat. If you really look at monastic scriptures, there's a stage where these monastic people, when they decide to unite with God, because the ultimate goal of monastic life is to live a life of absolute spirituality, so that you become united in spirit with God, and eventually die when you are at that highest stage where you receive, the Kalkidan, the Aklil, and so on. So she wanted to continue that life and started to Filsata Bahar, started to live in a jungle or in a forest. They were, feeding on wild grass for many months. And eventually Jesus appeared to her, or God appeared to her according to the text, and said, this is not your destiny. You're not meant to stay in a monastery. I want you to go out to the world and call my people. And he showed her examples like doves or precious cups to tell her that these are the souls that I want you to save for the kingdom. She refused. She said that I'm incapable of doing that, because she cared for people so much that what will happen if these souls go away from me? Now, this is the most important moment that changed her life. What changed her life is the Kal Kidan that God gave her. We may call it promise, but I don't think it has an equivalent word in English. We call it a Kal Kidan. It's like a covenant God made with her. That covenant is whoever comes to your monastery and starts this spiritual journey will not go back, will not perish. All will be saved. I will give you the power to know the future, and I will also give you the power to ask me if you want me to take the soul or the life of a person, because that person might go back and commit sin. Because in that spiritual understanding, it is better to die in the flesh and go to heaven than to live in the flesh and go to hell later on by committing sin. So he gave her all of these assurances, and she accepted her mission after that and went straight away back to the world, preaching against the converted king. This is a time when a lot of Ethiopians were being killed because of their faith. Others converted into Catholicism because they were scared. And we can remember, for example, the philosopher Yaakov. He was hiding in a cave and writing his philosophy at that time. He was not really coming out like her and fighting in the open. But she was particularly important in forcefully coming out, preaching in the open, telling against the king, and the king was furious. Many people were following her. So she was called to his court and then banished to a wilderness called Jibei, where she eventually created her first monastic community. And then, through the mediation of Fasilides, her son, and her brothers and her family in Fatigar and Dawaro, which really helped in creating a leverage to her advantage. People were coming and telling the king, if you do something against her, these people will rise against you. That is why he didn't want to kill her. So eventually she was released from that wilderness and started or created 7 monasteries. Monasteries where people who have had no places to go, who did not want to change their faith, ended up coming, congregating, and creating these monastic communities. And then she created strict monastic rules which were in place since the 4th century. If you read books like Marishag, Aragawi Menfasawi, all the monastic scriptures, Fatanagast, they provide for a very strict life. If you live in a monastery, you live as if you are a dead person. Right? So, she created that strict rules and started to live by them. At the time of her passing, her death, she was surrounded by people who admired and loved her, and died, replacing her friend, her sister, Ehta Christos, to lead the monasteries after her. So very briefly, it's a book-long text or story of Wolete Petros, written after her death, about 3 decades or so after her death, by scholars, Glaudius, who lived at that time. So it's a very important text that really explains how Ethiopians were struggling against this conversion, which could have really be used if we were fortunate enough to tap into our own history. If we were allowed to learn from the history of our ancestors, which our scholars tell us that it's rubbish, it's about superstition, this literature is biased. That's what they tell in Ethiopian textbooks. A history textbook, for example, that I read once says Ethiopian history is biased. The only rational Ethiopian history was first written by Hiob Ludolf, a German scholar who never came to Ethiopia even. So Europeans are regarded as objective, rational, but Ethiopian writers like our fathers, like Gelawdios, are regarded as biased. That is why we couldn't study and learn about all of this history. But when it is written by Westerners, it then becomes as a fashion and as an important discovery in knowledge and becomes popular. So in a nutshell, in a short, Woldeyes Petros was such an important figure in our history.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yirga. What a beautiful way you put everything. The whole story, again, was making me reminisce back to Woldeyes again. Even though, like, when I say Woldeyes, I don't want you to think that I was there for years, but I was in Debre Abay for twice, 6 months, and then another 3 months. So altogether 9 months. So what we do is Debre Abay, as you know, they're on when it's Madhanialim, or the 27th of Magabit, we students would go celebrate the feast in Abrentant. And as you know, let alone food or festivity, there's no tabut. It's just Sigdat and Sa'atat in Abrentant, as it's called in Woldeyes. So when I traveled, I remember I traveled twice. And, you know, traveling there, when I went and came back, I was half of your physique, Dr. Yirga. I don't look like the way I am right now. And one thing that I remember going there and what you wrote about their lifestyle that I was able to actually see in action is one covenant that is given about that monastery is that Hatyatai Shagarabish, or let no sin enter your place or your that monastery. And I always like when I was traveling, that's what I was thinking about. What does it mean? Hatyatai Shagarabish. Does this mean I'm no longer going to be a sinner? But when I traveled and the way the amount of energy it takes, like it's literally a full day of walking. It's more than 12 hours of walking. And it's not like a straight, a park-like walking. It's mountains, and as you know. So once we get there, and people, the monks, this is their everyday journey. They not only walk that long, but they serve, and on top of that, like you mentioned in your book, they only eat from the trees. Where it's not like these beautiful bananas that are ready to indulge, but they call it, as you know, it's abele. And there's 3 parts that they would make this. Quarf, actually, they call it all together. And there are 3 parts of it, right? There's the banana for the ones like the ones that are new would eat from the banana, and then there's the sabele, which is one of the most. It's very bitter and hard, and even poisonous if it's not well done. And then there's the dinich one that they make, and all together, that's all they eat basically. And this is not a full plate. Again, from what I've seen, it's one amount in their like little bowl. After they finish their work, so after they finish their service all night. And this is everyone, whether you're young or old, all of them there's no kind of food that would come there. On top of that, the sigdat, the tzalot, the lifestyle. Literally, then I understand they don't have time to even think of sin, like let alone they don't even have time to think about Satan, let alone sin. So I was kind of it was really an honor and a blessing for me to experience that. And the second time I went, I was able to experience it more for 10 days, where I was there actually for the whole Hamamat Sigda time, where it's like the actual perfect time to honestly go to Abrentant, where I remember how hard it was. It's basically for us, they've already indulged in it. They lived, it's like their lifestyle, but basically it's like they live only by water. There's this beautiful drink of water called Yordanos, which people use for tzebel and also for water. It's just, I have never tasted anything like it, by the way. I just want to say this now. It's more than tzebel, it's more than water. So basically they're living only by water, and only they wouldn't probably drink that only once like tzebel a day. So coming back to Laura Belcher, the writer of which also you also cover her and the contradiction or the negative things that she has written, unfortunately, about Woldeyes Petros. I was able to see some of her videos as well, and I remember I didn't know it was her that wrote this book, but I first saw it, and I remember how disturbed I was when just even reading it. You know how like first there's our culture, and then when you know about Waleta Petros, when you know about not only Waleta Petros, but the way the lifestyle, the way our fathers and our mothers, by the way, I haven't mentioned, I was able to see the mothers as well. How like even though Abrentant is not the like men's monastery, they would come and they have a place for their own. They stay over that night, but they have their own monastery in Woldeyes, as you know, and I've seen close up of how powerful and how strong the women as well are. So it's really, really disturbing for her to write this as a professor. Actually, what do you think intrigued her, or why do you think that both Westerners and also this Laura Belcher would write such a thing? What is her objective, or what was her goal in all of this?
Yeah, I think it's important to read from what we can read. You know, I wouldn't necessarily speculate on what really triggered them, what was the mentality behind it, and so on. But what we can say from what we read and from the evidence that is available to us through their writing is this is not just a writing of one person or two individuals. This is not necessarily because these individuals are not nice people and so on. And I don't want to take it necessarily personal. I want to see it as a system that is in place, as I said earlier, for a very long time. What does Ethiopian studies looks like? What is how is knowledge about Ethiopia being produced? For example, in their translation, they took one translation from an Italian scholar who translated the word koso as kus. You know, Risi, when he was translating, Waleta Petros was consuming koso. Koso is a bitter herb, as we know. And it was kind of to symbolize how Jesus drank the bitter cup. So she was doing that for the remission of the sin of her followers. So the earlier Italian translator translated this as kus. Kus means excrement. So she was consuming this. So they took that as it is. So it just shows you the connection between what is being done to Ethiopian studies, starting from its inception by Western scholars in the West up to the present, how they continue to reproduce these Orientalist and negative images of Ethiopia and Africa without really allowing the original speakers, the scholars that wrote and can read and interpret these materials. So probably what allowed them, instead of individually motivated them, but what enabled them to do this is the system of knowledge, the infrastructures, the institutions that are available to fund this type of ideas. So they, I think, for example, coming up with a new knowledge, a new theory is a big deal. It's in the book, for example, it's been presented as this is one of the most important findings in the history of same-sex relations in Africa. So bringing something in history is, although, if it were true, although it existed in Ethiopia, Ethiopians knew about it, written book about it, it's considered as if it didn't exist. Only when Europeans arrive, write about your history, say something about you that you exist in the minds of people. And because the imagined Africa, because ideas that go to the minds of people creates African identities, Africans' history, and so on, only them give us our history. We cannot tell or produce our own history. So, this was an attempt to invent an original history, although, the history that existed there could have been told or is told by the people themselves. So I think it is really a scholarship, an institution that enabled them. And second, Ethiopians ourselves, the absence of critical scholarship in Ethiopia. There's absolutely none for the last 4 or 5 years. People coming and writing and really strongly challenging this. There are people who wrote and really felt very disturbed like yourself about this. But, you know, we don't have institutions. We don't have places where that nurture a critical literature that could, you know, supply knowledge about Ethiopia. Our own people who have money, if they have money, what they do is they give it to those very people who perpetuate this type of stereotypes than create their own institution. So because we are intellectually being colonized, because there is a system of knowledge, a scholarship, it is called Ethiopian studies, but it is actually a study of Ethiopia using the lens of the West. There are Ethiopian studies institutions almost in many places, but they really do not incorporate Ethiopian indigenous voices. They're written basically for the consumption of Western readers or the West. Because of that, and also because of the vulnerable situation that these people have, and also the categories, the ideas that were really inserted in the book are very hard, very difficult to criticize. How can you criticize vulnerable people, people who may be prosecuted for various identities that they may have? So they're trying to hide behind these vulnerable people, but at the same time also take advantage of the fact that Ethiopia does not have this critical scholarship because the colonization of knowledge in Ethiopia, because of native colonialism, and also because there is this colonial orientalist scholarship that is prevalent in the West about Ethiopia or all over Africa as well.
Well said. And one thing, honestly, one follow-up question, if you could also answer this. What hit me is instead of always criticizing those that have written against us, we as well are at fault for not knowing our own history. For example, myself, I just recently, maybe 2 years ago, that I found out about ቅድስት ወለተ ጴጥሮስ and her story. But also, not only personally, but even in institutionalized wise and as an organization, why do you think there isn't enough, not only about Walatta Petros, but enough about our saints, even let alone institutions that we don't even see churches built under their name? Maybe there's monasteries, but we don't have them in like the cities where actually the youth and the new generation can learn about them. Why do you think that is, and what can we do about it in the future?
I think that's a very good question, and it would have a lot of answers, and some of the answers I may not know. But what I understand is, I think when you think about it, see our educators, see the people who give us ideas about the world, and those people have made those ideas part of who they are, part of their professional identity. Now, Ethiopian, if you look at it, how the Ethiopian education system, especially not the education system, but the political system, is constructed after the 1960s, especially after 1974 with the coming of the Derg. What we see is the creation of a system that makes the majority of the people irrelevant to knowledge production, irrelevant to development, even irrelevant to the state. Today, you cannot really think about a more important issue than the problem of large numbers of rural people. You know, 80% of Ethiopians live in rural villages, but they're not really the core of policy debate, of concern by the elites who are living in cities and so on. And all of this happens because the interest of people like myself, who are educated in the Western system, the interest of people who are leading the institutions, the politics, the economy, is constructed within this Western framework. They are part of this colonial structure. We are part of the colonial structure. And our own identity, our own salary, our own professional futures are built within that narrative, you know, within that system. So for a lot of students who are doing PhD, for example, if a PhD student tomorrow or yesterday wants to write his PhD in Amharic or in Oromifa, they cannot do that. There's basically no one who would allow that person to write a PhD dissertation, not just PhD dissertation, even a bachelor of or undergrad paper using the local language. It is not allowed.
And this is in Ethiopia?
We see it instead as a way of joining this system that would open opportunity for them. But if we see the whole system as it is, the system has incorporated some of us to become part of this global, colonial empire by removing the importance of the rest of the population, the rural farmers, who are paying for our education, who are paying for our sustenance, our injera, our culture, everything comes from them. But they're excluded. When they are violated, even some people really are scared of putting the picture of rural, impoverished Ethiopians on their profile or on their timelines, because they even don't associate, we even don't associate with them anymore. Our identity, what we want to become, has become part of the West. So you see, it is not just few individuals wanting to become mean or bad, but the very possibility of becoming a better person, of becoming educated person, has been constructed by a system that makes the majority irrelevant to it, even makes them, disposables. People who become disposable and whose abandonment, whose violence may trigger some form of uncomfortable reaction, but you wouldn't go anything to do something to change the system. That is why we have to understand, go beyond individuals, blaming why I didn't do this or write this and so on, but instead understand the system we are inserted into and try to critically engage with it to recreate what is important for everyone. And I think that is important.
Yeah. I was wondering, sorry, I apologize. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about who the translators are as far as their qualifications and what their overall translation and editing of this book looked like.
Yes, and I think what is really important and what I try to show in this work is how there are specific areas. The book is 500 pages long book, and there are so many material that I didn't use. There's so many other areas that have problems, and we might come back to them sometime in the future. But I think what was really important for me is to look at how African identity was constructed through this translation. And one of the identity is the identity of these monastic people who lived there, and their sexual identity or their identity of who they are as people who do certain things in terms of being violent or in terms of being doing certain things that are considered to be kind of weird. So I was interested in how identity is constructed because, as I said before, identities are made by representing what we daily do through languages, through signs, through texts. And the person who writes to represent other people's identity plays a critical role in constructing that identity. So I was interested in looking at how this identity has been constructed through this translation. Then I look at what are the texts, what are the sources that gave rise to this type of interpretation, and what are the methods, the procedures by which these people followed in order to arrive at their conclusions. So there were several issues, as I think it might be difficult to discuss all of the details of the material covered in a 96-page long article. There are technical words, but what they did, one of the things that they did is they inserted words which do not exist in the original text. For example, because they were interested, I think, in my probably speculation, but I think the material showed that, I think they were interested in showing the sexual life of these monastic people. They tried to introduce words which do not exist in the material. The word kissing or kiss, does not exist in the text, but it's been inserted more than once in many instances. Whenever the nuns meet with one another and greet one another, they use the word kiss to kind of eroticize their relationship. And also the insertion of the words that blur the spiritual and the corporeal relationship between people. Like instead of when the word clearly says, for example, bis means friend, they would use the word companion, which could be used also for people who may have, sexual or erotic relationships. So one of the techniques that they use is the introduction of words which do not exist in the original text, and that is, and sometimes when you translate, you may be able to do that, and I'm not against translation. And I think we have to understand there's a school that I've been consulting people who do work in a school of translation, some professors whom I know and respect, and others also who are concerned by the type of construction translation could turn out to be and how they could be violent. So the school of translation, people who really are in favor of translation, believe that you can't translate anything. The text is not protected. You can produce any type of meaning out of pre-existing texts. You can be suspicious of the text and so on. Mm-hmm. To some extent, I respect this approach. I respect this approach because, for example, I can give you an example. In the Gelaw, it says, the monastic people were eating fish, and they were making stew and eating fish. So they translated saying, oh, maybe they are eating dulet, asa dulet, because asa dulet is popular in Bahar Dar, in Lake Tana area, and so on. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not possible to conceive what type of, because asadulat apparently seems to be a recent invention of a stew in that area. But this type of translation is not necessarily problematic. Although you would question its authenticity and so on, I wouldn't go to the level of us saying everything must be exactly the same. Yeah. You see? But to insert words that do not exist in the material, or to translate texts in a way that poses significant harm to today's ways of constructing identity. For example, the construction of the identity of the Habesha is a big deal in the book. There is not a single word called the Habesha in the book. People may have different opinion about who are the Habesha, where do they come from, who are the highlanders, the lowlanders. I'm not engaging that material now. But what the translators did in that text is to insert this ethnic politics into the text by stating that, by basing their material, not based on the experience of the people they call were oppressed, but based on the colonial scholarship that invented African identities, that says that Africans do not have their own writing, their writings, their literature, their orthodox belief, their books, their Giza scholarship came from Arabs. So, they inserted the word Habesha more than 130 times or 100 times in the text when it doesn't exist even once. Mm-hmm. And then they started to talk about dialogues that people had with one another. For example, in a text, there was an anecdote which says that a woman was taking tawaf, a light tawaf, to the church of Woledyes. And on her way, she lost her tawaf. She forgot it. And then she was so distraught, she was so sad, and she said, oh, Woledyes, why did you make me forget my tawaf? Is that because I am sinful? Didn't your God said he came to save the sinful? Now, in this conversation, they created an ethnic identity called, I think, the Qimans, by saying that, look, why did this woman say your God instead of our God? Maybe this woman is not really Orthodox Habesha. Maybe this woman is a Qiman who are not Orthodox Christians, who are, secluded or excluded and so on. So that type of construction of identity is not going deep into the text. It plays into the politics of ethnicity today. It kind of feeds into this ongoing problem that exists in terms of on the basis of ethnicity in Ethiopia. I am in favor of the writing about every culture, every ethnic groups in Ethiopia. We haven't done that, and there's a need for significant work around that topic. But to use again the word Habesha based on writings such as Baji or Konti Rossini, which introduced this racist classification of the world based on the children of Noah, for example, the Hamitic thesis, the inferiors which are meant to become slaves for the whites. And from there, other people also introduced that conception into anthropology, and eventually came into the Giz literature through these writers like Baji and Conti Rossini, which are cited several times in their translation. These people brought the idea of the Habesha to alienate the so-called Highlanders from Ethiopia, to say that their religion, their texts came from those places. Now, because the link between this narrative and the way they interpret the text creates significant harm in today's Ethiopia. So even if people are really in favor of translation, I don't think it is possible to ignore the construction of identities that may end up being violent to people's way of relating with one another. Today, we have to remember Rwanda, for example, how the Hamitic thesis was constructed to alienate the Tutsis from the Hutus and to present them as enemies that can be killed. So this type of construction of identity, which was done and is now being used as if it's an original text and a revelation for the advantage it has for political purposes, is really something that is concerning me. And that's why, although it is delicate and difficult, I thought we have to bring that and challenge it.
Absolutely. I was just wondering, are they, from what you've been able to infer, are they really qualified to translate these texts to begin with?
I think that is a very good question. As I said, there is controversy on that.
Yeah.
I think, in my opinion, if you want to translate a text, you have to be able to read it.
Yeah.
So these people, obviously, especially the main translator, which is Professor Belcher, she doesn't know or understand the text from what she said and from how it's been presented in the evidence so far. She doesn't read Giz. She doesn't understand the indigenous interpretation of the text. So you need to read the book that you claim is the authority in translating and bringing to the world. If you cannot read it, and if the only way you can do is by working with people who can read the text, you have to have someone who understands the context and the text in which the text is written. There is no Ethiopian qualified Giz scholar that was involved in the translation. Those who are qualified, whom they went and asked for the key meaning, for a keyword in their translation, the word is mar'a, those people gave their own translation, but they were ignored. They were ignored as if they were, homophobic or biased. So, you ignore people who know about the text. You don't know about the text. And after that, you created an original knowledge that can be celebrated everywhere. How do you do that? I think the answer is because you have the power to do that. The power system that privileges white scholars to construct ideas, meanings, theories based on the geographical or human body that exists in Africa, in Ethiopia, and advances their scholarship.
Yeah. We're having a conversation about colonial rewriting of African history. Please share this conversation with your friends and family and like it as well. And we'll be back after a brief break.
አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን አምቢኝ ብለው የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና ዕውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎም ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን አደባባይ ኢንፎ ሚዲያ @gmail.com፣ በዌብሳይታችን www.አደባባይ.com። ያግኙን፣ ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ።
Welcome back, everyone. We're having a conversation about colonial rewriting of African history, focusing more of a case study of the interpretation of Waleta Bedros's history as well. And we're here with Dr. Yirga. And my question for you next is that, how do we move forward, and what is the assignment each of us could take upon ourselves? And I don't know if we have lost him. I think he might have dropped off. So we'll just be right back. We'll go ahead and fix his connections and we'll be right back. Oh, there he is. Welcome back. I thought I lost you for a second.
Okay. How do you move forward? I think there are still pressing and urgent matters in relation to this scholarship. And I think every Ethiopian should understand this, and I think we need to challenge this, because one of the main reasons why I engaged in this text is because of what's coming. Because in addition to what I said earlier, I happen to read forthcoming publications by these same scholars, the same people who do not understand Giz properly, who are not using Ethiopian interpretation and context properly, are now engaged in translating Ethiopia's most precious texts. They're translating them into English. One of these texts is the text of the Kibra Negest. The Kibra Negest is an important text for Ethiopia's foundation, Ethiopia's existence. We remember Emperor Johannes when he became king. The British had stolen or taken Ethiopian manuscripts from Magdala, and they took the book of the Kibra Negest with them, with the rest of the properties as they stole. And he wrote a letter to them saying, of all the materials they took, he talked about the Kibra Negest. Without this text, my people will not obey me. This is a book that is important for my my people, my country. Please return that book. And the British, which are known not to return anything that they have stolen or looted, ended up returning the Kibra Negest to Emperor Johannes because it was so important for Ethiopia. Now look how the Kibra Negest is being projected, being interpreted by Professor Belcher in her previous rendition of the Kibra Negest. She says, the Kibra Negest talks about Ethiopia, but Ethiopia is ahistorical. It's like, it's not historically true to use the name Ethiopia. And also it belongs, it's kind of, she relegates the Kibra Negest text to mean a text of the so-called Highlanders, the people who are, painted as ethnocentric and so forth. Not only that, there are significant concerns with understanding the words of the Kibra Negest, understanding its importance in relevance to Ethiopia's context. And no one is challenging this ongoing interpretation of the Kibra Negest of her and her co-translator, Michael Klein. In my opinion, on the basis of what they did, their inability to even distinguish between Kus and Koso, their inability to really understand the sensitivity of the texts, the meanings that they are giving to these important texts, the absence of an organized or an Ethiopian scholarship that challenges this, because the Giz speakers are powerless in today's colonized Ethiopian scholarship. In this context, allowing these people to translate these texts is allowing and perpetuating colonialism on Africans. The Kibra Negest is a text that defines what state means in the African context. A lot of people talk about nationalism, for example, believing that nationalism, a conception of the nation in the Western thought, is similar to the conception of a nation in the African context. African form of nationalism has its own problems. There are criticisms that may come as a result of reading the Kibra Negest or any other text, but that has to be done by Ethiopians and people who understand the text. So one of the serious issues that has to be taken up by all Ethiopians is to really be a voice in terms of saying that this interpretation of the Kibra Negest, without reading what it is saying, based on the power that they have because they have funding to do it, is violence against Ethiopian identity, against Ethiopian culture. It has to be done by people who can read, understand, and interpret the text. This should not happen. Second, these people are again, or especially the Professor Belcher at Princeton, is engaged in the translation of Ta'amra Mariam. Ta'amra Mariam, as you may know, is a book, a text that is revered, that is really respected in a culture of the Tawahdo Church. Even people who cannot have Holy Communion believe that listening to the story is as important, as powerful, as sacred as having a Holy Communion. That is a very fundamentally important text. And no credible institution, no credible scholar has the privilege, the power to desacralize, to trample upon the sacred beliefs of vulnerable communities. This is against the scholarship. This is not ethical. It's only because there are no critical, there are some, but many critical scholars who are opposing and confronting them doesn't mean that they are right. So they are engaged in writing about Ta'amra Mariam. I'll give you an example, a very graphic way of how they are, especially Professor Belcher is intending to translate this text. In the way Ethiopians portray dead people, when in their traditional way of representing them, dead people are, portrayed naked. That means they don't have a physical sexual body. But in the translation of the Ta'amra Mariam that has been produced, a sexual relationship between these people who are painted in their dead bodies is presented as if they are physically having sex. And also, in another text which talks about Bela Esa, there is an emphasis on cannibalism, a story as if that is a story that represents Ta'amra Mariam. So they're interested in showing, by really engaging in this stories of sin. Sometimes when you have Ta'amra Mariam, when sinful people come to the grace of Mary and being reconciled, the people's story in that text is not representative of the people necessarily. If there is someone who commits sin, killing people, it doesn't mean that Ethiopians are murderers. But by taking these peculiar, deviant, or sinful characteristics as are representative of the culture of the people, you can look at the title the Professor Belcher gave for her exhibition to show representative texts of the Ta'amra Mariam. They call it Remorseless Cannibals and Loving Scribes. To say this represents the story of Ta'amra Mariam, and to go on publishing a book about Ta'amra Mariam on this basis is simply dismissing and desacralizing Ethiopian cultural, spiritual identities. This all comes from, I think, some people, it feeds into some people's a very difficult to understand type of hate toward this, or disregard, or lack of concern for the effect of this type of translation. Now, I'm not interested in personally attacking people or individuals, because the person is not able to do this. It must be supported by institutions which have looted the manuscripts that belong to poor people and give it to scholars who do not even read the text. Look at Middle Eastern studies in Princeton University. Look at ancient European story writers and ask, do these people write without knowing the text? If I can go to European funders or Western funders and ask, I want to translate the holiest books of Europe, but I don't read or understand Latin, would they fund me? Would they give me status? Would they make me professor? This is allowed because there is no care for Africa. Africans, you can write anything about Africans and nobody can criticize you. So Ethiopians, a lot of us are really blind to what is happening, as I said, because our own language constructed identities are made within this Western system, although we have roots in Ethiopia. And I think this should not happen. And I think Princeton University is a great university. They have produced a lot of scholarship, like Toni Morrison, for example, Professor Ephraim Isaac.
I think we're just getting, we lost him for a bit. But really, to add to what he's saying, and when we come back, he'll continue his idea. This is a really prime example of what Orientalism is, and in that sense of writing about a culture and tradition from my own perspective, as opposed to the perspective and the time frame in which that the events had happened of the people that I'm writing about. And this comes from a place of very entitlement, of not even wanting to give the others or the people that we're writing about the benefits of writing about their own history, the benefit of telling you their own history, and the benefit of having a say in the way that their identity is shaped, and the who and the what of who they are, and taking that completely out of their hand and making it your own, and also at the same time making money off of it, right? Like when we're writing about these books, when we're translating them in a way that's very violent to the culture, at the same time we're selling books, we're selling tickets to our shows, and we're making money off of it. And this is really a prime example of what colonialism looks like. Diakon Ephraim, do you have anything to add to this?
Let's take a break and then we'll come back. Let's do
Okay.
that.
Sounds good.
Welcome back, Adewabye Viewer Digest family. We have been with us for the past an hour and 40 minutes together. We were with Dr. Yirga discussing on colonial writing of African histories. Please do share and like our conversation, and thank you for all of you that have been with us throughout the whole time. I believe we've lost Dr. Yirga for about a minute, and we will have him. We're almost done. We're just to say his last words. Of course, this is not the only time that he will be with us. We will keep having him in the future. Hewitt, do you have anything until Dr. Yirga comes?
Yeah, and like there's also one thing that I remembered about how Africans have been written about, and this comes from Bell Hooks, how she talks about even the term feminism, we should shy away from it because it doesn't apply to African feminism or the diaspora, the African-American experience of what feminism is, because we see that white women has used feminism to abuse Black women as well. And also to add to that is that idea of describing Black women almost close to animals and using them in a way that is dehumanizing and talking about them in a way very dehumanizing. She comes up with this term called Womenism to describe the feminism and also the agency of Black people getting back into their bodies and having that agency to talk about their own identities and their own struggles in a way that's beneficial to us. And here we see that perfect example where a white woman is, interpreting a history about a Black woman. By the way, this Black woman existed in the 17th century. She is also considered a saint. So she has a lot of power and agency in the context of the history of the general Black history when we're looking at it. That's a time where people are still in slavery, right? And for her to be able to go into this history in a way that's very colonial, very disrespectful of the way people see, especially Ethiopians see Welete Petros, and feel entitled to go ahead and interpret this is a prime example of that as well. And we'll just take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll go ahead and wrap the event up.
አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን አምቢኝ ብሎ የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና ዕውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎ ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን አደባባይ infomedia@gmail.com፣ በዌብሳይታችን www.adebabai.com። ያግኙን፣ ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ።
Diakon Ephraim, I don't think, I think we got him back.
Yeah.
We lost you for a second.
We can't hear you still, Doctor. Did you mute yourself? We still can't hear you, Doctor. Welcome back. I think we do have him back, Dr. Yirga. Brothers and sisters that have been with us throughout this time, we've been discussing with Dr. Yirga Gelaw about colonial rewriting of African histories. We've learned a lot from him, and basically I've learned a lot from him, and it's been a very inspiring conversation. And one thing that I might add is I believe everything that we've talked about today, Dr. Yirga and Hewitt, you might agree to this. Last time when while you guys were in dialogue, I remember the conversation we also had with Hannah, and how a lot of it is connected to Black Lives Matter here in America, or that African identity around the world, where the way we face the struggle or the colonial problem might be different, but it has a connection. So pretty much we have an obligation, and some of our brothers and sisters think Black Lives Matter issue is something different, and then our issue is different. And there are even people that even disagree, or even kind of say, why do you guys even talk about Black Lives Matter when it's actually our matter? So what I learned is we need to do more and understand that the issues is connected, and the only people that could stand up for the rights of basically the issues is Black people ourselves, or it's us that we could stand up for the issues and for the things that have happened. But a lot of times we wait for the scholars to rewrite history, or the professors to rewrite history. And what we have is we have now professors that not only went under the red line of completely fabricating a lie, but even contradicts against research itself, how you're supposed to research. So that's what have been getting out of this. Dr. Yirga, maybe just for a last question, one last question before another question. I mentioned a little bit about Black Lives Matter, and it's been part of, even though the American part of the debate when it comes to racism might seem a little bit different or extreme here in the United States, at least from what I see it. What do you say for those Ethiopian Americans living here or around the world abroad that are experiencing that Black colonialism or racism wherever they are? What is the message that you have basically for the youth and all Ethiopian Americans and all Ethiopians abroad?
Yeah.
I think that's a very important question. I think something which is very important, even something which Ethiopia should have been the leader of, because, you know, Black lives don't matter, partly because Black history doesn't matter, partly because Black history is regarded as a history written only by white people or colonial scholarship, even Black people who are supported or advanced through that scholarship. So you see, when Black people in America started their resistance against oppression, they gained inspiration from the Ethiopian history, a history that said no to colonialism, a history that really revolted against colonial ambitions, the victory on Adwa and others. So, you know, and they try to tap into our spiritual history too. You can see the Ethiopianism. Before Pan-Africanism, the movement of Black people was Ethiopianism, or Black Ethiopia. Ethiopia, the word itself, or the name itself, represented Black people, and it had a significant, and still has a significant inspiration. But because of this colonial construction of identities, because Ethiopians are not able to put their ideas into the global exchange of knowledges, because they have don't have institutions, a lot of Black people who are struggling against oppression could not really understand and become part of Ethiopia's indigenous knowledges, indigenous religion and history. And as I also earlier mentioned, you know, one of the problems that we also face is even the name Christianity itself. When we call ourselves Christian, in the way we understand Christianity being from an Ethiopian point of view, not necessarily part of Western Christianity that allowed, for example, the doctrine of discovery, you know, the papal bull starting from the 15th century, how the world was given to Europeans to rule by the power or the name of God or in the name of Christianity. Because of that name, it was very easy for writers from a Western background to twist our history and disconnect us from the rest of Africa. So as Ethiopians, I think what we should do is really Black Lives Matter is very fundamental, very important, but it also is important because there is Black history that is considered as irrelevant or that is being dismissed, starting from the Hegelian or other assumptions which says that Africans don't have history. You know, this history is important. So we have something to take to this movement. In addition to Black Lives Matter, I think we have to hashtag and campaign saying Black history matters too. And I know that there are groups of scholars, professors from all over the world who are, you know, preparing an open letter to Princeton University, asking them, you know, that Black history matters too. And that is inspired by Ethiopian history, which is disregarded mainly by not just Princeton University, but a lot of other areas too. So Black Lives Matter is very important, but you know, there are instances, for example, like the way this translation was made, where this critical scholarship, the criticism against the West, sometimes is used to dehumanize or to even harm us by using it against us. How they do that is by disconnecting it with the reality in Africa. For example, take how the word Habesha has been constructed. You know, instead of understanding what Habesha means, what Ethiopia means, based on Ethiopian experience and history, they use the literature that is being constructed to divide us and to create these ethnicist and tribalist identities as a source document, so that these critical ideas against the West will be used also against us, so that the decolonizers become colonizers. Those who become critical become uncritically challenging their own fathers, their own mothers, their own past history, by looking at it through this lens, critical lens, which is borrowed, not organically developed based on what they hear from our grandmothers, how Muslim brothers and sisters, how different ethnic parents live together in Ethiopia, have made all of us together and stand us in the world as the only country in Africa that has never been colonized. So when we use critical scholarship from outside, let's use and bring also our experience, our forefathers and fathers' experience, not just take it as an ideology. With that caveat, I think it is important to embrace and be part of this Black Lives Matter movement. We live at a time when identity is the most important weapon of politics. You know, when Huntington wrote his book, The Future of World Politics or the Future of Change will be cultural, or war will be civilizational, because in the past it used to be on the base of ideology, the socialist versus the capitalist. When the socialist versus the capitalist bloc fall apart, what they predicted and in part also contributed to is the creation of a world that is very much troubled, reformulated on the base of violence by ethnic identities. So this violence using identity is not peculiarly given to Ethiopia. All over Africa, if you go today, people are fighting with each other on the base of their identities. Look in Ethiopia, you know, whatever bad history, if we had, let's say we had bad history in the past on the imperial time, whatever. But remember the Derg period, the 17 years that destroyed, that killed so many people. People who are, you know, the elders or the monarchical people, or are called the feudals. Many of them were exterminated physically, they were killed. Their land was taken away from them. They no longer had any structure, any means to control power. 28 years after that, you have ethnic-based politics in the country that recreated Ethiopia in a totally different way. So we don't have the material structure, power structure that is in place to challenge it using colonial thesis that is imported from the West. We have to imitate simply what exists as valid and impose it on our people, and feel that when deconstruct, when we attack our own heritage, our own culture, we feel that we are becoming critical, and that is counterproductive. So I think what we have to do is to take this balance, to understand that we need to criticize Western impositions, but also we should not feel that we are everything. We can tell our people what to think and how to change their lives, how to live their future. We have to listen to them and build on the good things that they have. So with that, I encourage everyone to really advocate for Black History Matters. This open letter will come out in a few days. And I really encourage everyone to share it across social media so that it becomes part of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yirga Gelaw. Just one more question. What does being Ethiopian mean to you?
Okay, I think that's a very important question. It's a slightly tricky as well, and I'll say the reason. You see, I recently, Professor Efe was, I think, interviewed in this program, and he talked about two tribes in Africa, in Ethiopia. He said there are two tribes in Ethiopia. One is the tribe of poor people. The other one is the tribe of the elites, the Mercato people that he called them. And the tribe of the poor and the Mercato people are divided on the basis of power relationship. You see, what colonial scholarship tried to make us think is forget our power relationship. Forget who is benefiting who from what. Just remember your identity as a defining factor for your poverty. In the same way they use, by the way, in American slavery. If you go back to Bacon's Rebellion, how after Bacon's Rebellion in America, that is the time when Black identity, Black people were turned into slaves by law. How did they do that? Was Black people and white people before that, indentured British poor people, were living together. And they both revolted against the 1%, the rich ones. Then the rich British landowners came up with a formula saying, why did these poor people come together and revolted against us? And then they wanted to find something that divided them. And they say Black people will have less power than the whites. By that divide and rule policy, what they did was the whites started to feel that they belong to the 1%, although their material life is similar to the poor black ones. You see, so that, poor white Americans today feel that they belong to the billionaire Donald Trump rather than the poor person next to them. Because identity is weaponized to justify political sabotage. So the same thing happened, I think, in Professor Ephraim's classification, and I support that classification because it's not just identity that divides us, that is important for us. It's also important to see power relationships. Who is running our economy? Where is the economic discussion about our farmers? For me to be an Ethiopian is to be part of this majority of our population, what they live and where they come from. You see, when you think about yourself, you can think about a person standing at a place. I call it a place-based perspective. Thinking about the world from the position of one particular place that you choose. That place for me is the place which I grow up from, a place of poor rural farmers who struggle to get water, who really are impoverished because they are forgotten by policymakers. Rural farmers in Ethiopia, as I said, I was a shepherd. I grew up in the rural farm and also lived in a small town. So I think the world from the perspective and interest of the people in Ethiopia, in that place. If you just imagine yourself as a farmer today, as an Ethiopian farmer, which means representing like 80% of the population, what is your government doing about your life? What type of policy have they presented? What is really worrying them to change the life you live, where you have very little land you've been dividing and giving to the many families that you have, and where your children are going and learning something that you can never understand, but now make you end up worrying about their welfare because they are engaging in this ethnic hate and politics. What is the world? What is knowledge? What is the systems, this development, this education, all of the things that people talk about mean for you as a rural Ethiopian farmer? If we cannot think ourselves Ethiopianness based on the life that is lived by the majority, we are still in that global empire because we benefit from it. We want to expand the elections, the programs that benefit, that are accessible to people like us. But those people are left to die, are disposed to face the fate that we bring upon them because of how we engage with each other. So I think to be an Ethiopian for me is to stand at a place of that locality and think about the world, how the world treats them. And that is very important for me. And for me, an Ethiopian is that. And if I don't take your time, just one last point.
Please.
Also, I think there are 3 types of Ethiopians. I said at the beginning, there are 2 Africans. And for me, there are 3 Ethiopians. That is to say that Ethiopia has been constructed because, the word Ethiopia does not represent everyone living actual life in the world. It's a text, it's an image that pops up in our mind and makes us think about, what Ethiopia means to us. So how did Ethiopia become part of this image that we have about our people in our country, in our history, and so on? And I think Ethiopia has been created by elites in different ways. Of course, the first Ethiopia, the Ethiopia of the rural farmers, the Ethiopia of the poor who are simply disregarded as irrelevant in politics. That Ethiopia lived for centuries. It is that Ethiopia which sustained the independence of the country, which accepted Christianity, Islam, Protestant, everyone with all the culture that we have now, which provided us the language, the Amharic, the Ge'ez, the literature, which gave us the food that we eat. We call it indigenous knowledge or local knowledge. Everything that is produced is from that culture, from that Ethiopia. And I call that Ethiopia the organic, the real Ethiopia. Unfortunately, that Ethiopia is not represented in the texts of scholars, politicians, which are talking about Ethiopia today. Because for them, Ethiopia is created in two different phases after the 1960s. One of that Ethiopia that has been made for them is the tribalist Ethiopia. The other one is the unionist Ethiopia. The unionist Ethiopia, the one Ethiopia, is an Ethiopia that has been formulated on the basis of the importance of Western knowledge to change Ethiopia and make it part of the West. Remember the socialist system, for example, how they've been importing everything produced in the West as if that's everything we have to do in the country. And they're importing, because they were importing an idea that was violent to the country's identity, the country's history. Resistance started to build up and created another tribalist Ethiopia. Another Ethiopia based on a literature again, imported from the West rather than the lived experience of the people, which says that the Ethiopian identity has to be constructed as an ethnic categories coming together and forming an Ethiopia. In both these two Ethiopias, the real narrative of the people, the culture, the tradition, the religion, the lived experience is missing. It's not part of politics. So this is the politics of elites who do not really engage with the real life of the people. If they were doing that, today we are seeing significant climate crisis in Ethiopia, across the world. Impoverished farmers are worried about the rain. When I went to rural places, people are worried about madaberia, fertilizer. Nobody cares about the peculiar characteristics of their land. They distribute to them the same type of fertilizer across the country.
Oh, yeah.
They are ended up. They don't really investigate what is needed for the soil, what experiences the farmer have. Students and kids go to school and study Western education in English, and they cannot contribute to their own people. This goes on and goes on, reproducing itself. But remember this. This happened because this is how Africa, the poor, are incorporated into this global empire. This is when we become governable entities. But unfortunately, we become also useless for this global empire eventually, because we have to convert everything we have into foreign currency, because development is simply the changing of natural resources into cash, nothing else. So a lot of our people become irrelevant. When they become irrelevant, they become disposables, not being part of politics. Then they ended up dying and killing each other in the same way that we see in recent times. So what I really try to appeal to a lot of Ethiopians, and following on what Professor Ephraim Isaac was saying, is that let's engage with the real people's life experience and focus on what works best in our country. And if we do that, I think we will have a good chance, because that literature, that culture, although we are really violently trying to destroy it now, is still organic, still living, and we can build. And that's why I try with a few of my friends, I'm trying to reach out people. Let's come together and try to create an institution that will produce knowledge for Ethiopia, because all institutions exclude indigenous voices from their production of knowledge.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I will reiterate what my co-host said. I'm learning a lot, and I know our viewers are learning a lot as well. And they're telling us how thankful they are for your work and for you coming here and to share your knowledge with us as well. If you could just tell us where we can find some of your work, and if you have any last thoughts or words you want to say to us, I'll give you back the mic, so to speak.
Thank you very much. I'm really humbled. I really appreciate this platform, and I really appreciate the work you do. I really encourage you to engage more with what you are doing, continue to do what you are doing. And I think at the end of the day, we have one country, we have people who are living in that one country, and because that country, that land unites us, we really have to listen to each other. For me, I try my best in this university where I am, although my significant workload is to teach students human rights
and engage with their text and work, which I enjoy because I have wonderful people around here. I'm not worried by Ethiopianist or Orientalist scholars who really want to edit everything I say about Ethiopia because it doesn't go well with the scholarship that's been produced by the West in the past for Ethiopia. So that is a big privilege I got. I'm able to write this literally because I have this freedom that I found in a space that really allows this type of scholarship. And I think this has to be created in many places too. And if there are Ethiopians who want to engage in this type of scholarship, I'm open for conversations. We have created a small website, but this just at the beginning stage. We have the website, we have some people. The next stage is to invite as many people as possible to have dialogue and to really decide where to go and what to do about our present and the future as well. So in that respect, I invite anyone who is interested in this to talk to us, to talk to me. I have my email and website, and also anyone to prepare events. Few people were inviting me to give talks for their initiatives. I'm happy to share what I know. And ultimately, it's our responsibility. It is our time. The time itself requires us to take leadership in our lives, and we have to do that together. And thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And we know that there's a 12-hour difference between us and you. So we're really thankful that you're interrupting your day to have this conversation with us. And just to wrap this up, I want to paraphrase something that you've said, and this is, the time has come for Africans to tell our own stories to the world and make sure that we are part of that conversation and we are part of that work that we have been given. Thank you so much for everyone that joined us in this conversation, and we'll see you with a different event and different guests and next Thursday. Until then, have a wonderful evening and a wonderful day, depending on where you are. Thank you.
Thank you.